Hi, my name is Colleen Lamott, and I'm an OpenSciEd teacher and writer in the state of Washington. And I'm excited to talk to you today about Lesson 2 because this lesson really allows students to analyze and interpret data using complex data sets to find patterns and make sense of things that are happening in their world, just like scientists do. So let's recap a bit about how we got here. We just finished the anchoring lesson where we figured out that penguins living today have a lot of characteristics in common with each other, as well as this one ancient penguin species called Pedro. In addition to these similarities, they also have some pretty key differences. So, as we move into lesson 2, we're really wondering how similar or different are these various penguin species? So let's take a look at the lesson at a glance, and we'll get a high-level overview of the key elements that you can expect. So to begin, this is an investigation lesson. It takes 2 days, and it does have a hands-on investigation component. It does not require any additional devices or additional related videos, but do note that it requires 60 minutes of prep time. And I highly recommend that you prepare these materials at least a day in advance. This is not something that you'd want to do the morning of. And the lesson itself can be divided into 2 chunks or sense-making loops. In our first sense-making loop, students are wondering what connections, if any, exist between different penguin species. And we investigate this question by first deciding that we really need to look at data on heritable characteristics, and then we work in groups to analyze the data and look for patterns. We figure out that penguin species, modern and Pedro, can be categorized in different ways based on patterns in these heritable structures and behaviors. But we also figure out that there is really little of this data available for Pedro, since these are hard to preserve in the fossil record. And so we figure out that we really need to look at some other data. So in this sense-making loop, we analyze data that is more likely to be preserved in the fossil record, specifically bones. So students are going to be focused on bringing in these heritable internal structures to make sense of what's going on. And we figure out that some penguin species share more identical variations across these internal structures. These variations are inherited, and so therefore they would be passed from generation to generation. And that makes us think, well, maybe these penguins with more heritable structures in common are related. So in summary, by the end of this lesson, it's really critical that students have figured out penguins share heritable structures and behaviors. Variation in these characteristics exist between the species, but some of the species share many more variations than others. And as a result of that, we're left wondering about other ancient penguin species. Where do they fit into this picture? How do the body structures of other ancient penguins compare to modern penguins? And now that we've looked at the sense-making loops, let's zoom in on a few embedded key moments. In part 2, you are going to be using the penguin timeline model from lesson 1 to help motivate the investigation. So specifically, you'll use the timeline to orient students to the conversation about where we're going to go next, what do we need to investigate, and then add to it as this discussion is unfolding. So I like to think of the timeline as really a tool that is going to support students in understanding generational relationships within species, the time scale that we're considering, like is it ancient, is it modern, and in determining that the data we analyze should focus on these heritable characteristics. And because the focal practice of this lesson is on analyzing and interpreted data, and we're going to be working with these really large data sets, it's critical that students are part of the process of selecting the data so it makes sense to them. In part 3, this is when students are going to start working in pairs to really start analyzing this data. So each group will receive a set of data strips and a key to help them decode what these data strips are telling them, and then they'll look for patterns in the data. Students will organize the penguins into groups based on these patterns, and then annotate their groupings. And it's important to keep in mind that the purpose of this part is for students to really engage in this practice of analyzing large data sets to figure out that different species share similarities and differences in structures and behaviors. But we don't need to worry if the student groupings vary. We're not looking for a right answer here. There's a lot of different ways that students can organize this data. In part 8, this is after students have figured out that we really need more kinds of data. Specifically, we want to look at the bones. And so students receive this additional data to analyze for more patterns. And it's suggested that students get time first looking at the data strips, then bringing in the key, and then doing groupings and making a record of these groupings and why they chose to group them the way that they did, using these penguin stickers and annotations. So as a reminder, clear patterns will start to emerge as the students are bringing in more data. However, we're still not looking for a right answer because there are still multiple ways that they can be thinking about this data depending on the patterns that they're choosing to focus on. So in this lesson, it's really important to keep in mind we are valuing the process over the product. And here's a look at what they might come up with in their notebooks as they're annotating this process of grouping based on patterns. By the end of the lesson, we have analyzed a lot of data and found patterns between modern penguins and possibly Pedro, but we still have many questions about ancestry. And we realize that we need more data on other ancient penguins to explore the connections and uncover additional patterns or relationships that may exist. So now that we've explored the lesson, I'm going to share some tips and tricks I've used to manage the materials and support students' access and sense making throughout this lesson. For part 3, students will be analyzing data, and that data will be located in this file and organized into strips. These strips are really data tables that, if we look at a little bit more closely, each of these data tables or strips represents one of the 19 different species of penguins that we're looking at. On the left-hand column of this data strip, if we look up closer, we'll see letters. On the right side, numbers. On the left, this represents the structures and behaviors for this particular species. On the right, it shows the variation of those particular structures and behaviors. And you can see that on the key, the letter code and number code is translated into this overall document. Once students are looking at part 8, they are analyzing more data. They are now looking at the internal structures as well as the external structures. The internal structures on this particular file are located on the top, and the external structures are on the bottom. I fold these data strips in half so that students are only looking at one set of data at a time. And then I cut the data into strips so that students can individually manipulate them. Additionally, I print them on different colored paper so I know that students are looking at the data that I expect them to be looking at. I also print it on cardstock and laminate so I can reuse them. I store them in clear plastic bags or clear envelopes so that I can see if everything is there. And I code each set so that I can marry any of the lost data strips with its appropriate group. I personally use different colored stickers for this system. For accessibility, I find that color coding the variations is really helpful. I got this idea on Facebook group. What a brilliant concept. I love it. And it's really helpful for my students. I also like to put a picture of each penguin species at the top of the data strip so students can just quickly look and know what we're talking about. On the key, I add images to represent the different structures, and then I make sure to follow the same color coding system on the key that I've used on the data strips. When analyzing all of these data and looking for patterns, students can get some data fatigue if you don't use a timer. But I find that using a timer and really keeping to the time suggestions in the teacher guide helps make sure that students stay interested and really allows us to emphasize the process and not the product. I've never had penguin stickers. And as an alternative to the penguin stickers, which are used in part 3 and part 8 for students to keep a record of how they've sorted the different penguin species. Instead, I use whiteboards, and then I have a class set of these penguin strips. As I mentioned before, they are laminated and printed on cardstock, and students can just simply move those around, and then using the whiteboards and whiteboard markers, they annotate directly on that. To keep a record of it, I take a picture, I print a couple of them, and then I post those printed copies up in a public space for us to reference later. Students will be earning the word heritable, which will be co-constructed and added near the end of part 2 as students are suggesting the kind of data that we want to evaluate in our investigation. We'll be encountering a variety of words, including the word characteristic. Note that characteristic is used instead of trait because technically a trait is specific to a single species. If your students are using the word trait, that's okay, but try your best to reinforce the use of the word characteristic. As well, students will be applying some words that they used in the previous lesson, and those are listed here on the screen. For poster management, I always have my driving question board and future investigations chart where everyone can see them because we interact with those during most class periods. As well, the Penguin timeline model is going to be added to and updated through the first lesson set, so you'll want to have that one handy. Again, we'll be updating that model in this particular lesson. As well, students will have their progress tracker that they are updating. So that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining me as we go through this lesson 2. My students really enjoyed this lesson because they got to analyze data and get excited about what they were noticing as they were acting as real scientists. So hopefully this video will help you as you do this lesson with your students. Thanks for watching.